The sky that evening looked like an oil painting left out in the rain. Deep streaks of violet and rust bleeding into one another. The horizon a trembling line between day and night. Caleb Boone rode slow, his mare's hooves dull against the dirt road. Every creak of saddle leather and soft jingle of bridle rings sharp in the hush. The prairie around him sprawled endless, dry grasses bowing low in the cool wind. A mournful symphony that made a man feel small. He liked that about the land, that it humbled him. Though tonight the silence felt heavier, like Clara's absence had stretched itself across the plains. He could almost see her when the wind moved a certain way. The faint lift of her golden hair, her laughter dissolving into the sky. She'd been gone 3 years, and still, he carried her as though she were draped over his shoulders, like the worn duster he wore. The town came into view as twilight bruised itself into darkness. A place barely alive, it seemed, with its peeling storefronts and warped boardwalks. The saloon's swinging doors clattered faintly. Yellow lamplight spilled onto the street, like whiskey on old wood. A couple of ranch hands leaned against a hitching post, their laughter rough and unkind. From a window above the mercantile, a curtain shifted. Someone watching, judging, whispering perhaps. Caleb's boots made no sound when he dismounted. He was used to eyes on him, used to the stories told about the rancher who never smiled, the man who let grief rot him from the inside. He'd never cared much for gossip, but he could feel it clinging to him tonight like burrs on wool. He was tying his mare when a sharp voice cut through the dusk. "We don't want your pity. Keep your coin." It was a girl's voice, steady though thin with strain. Caleb turned his head and saw them. 2 figures at the edge of the corral. One was little more than a slip of a thing, barefoot in a faded dress, her hair hanging in dark ropes down her back. She clutched a scrawny chicken tight against her chest, its wings flapping weakly. The other, her sister, Shirley, stood taller, her shoulders square. Chin tilted high, though she couldn't have been more than 17. She held her ground against a ranch hand twice her size, who mocked their attempt to sell the bird. "No one's going to buy a sack of bones," the man sneered, flicking the coin she'd offered back at her feet. Laughter echoed from his companion. Caleb lingered in the shadows, hands tucked into the pockets of his duster. He studied the girls, not because he meant to interfere, but because something about them rooted him to the spot. The elder's jaw was clenched hard, her hand protective on her sister's shoulder. The younger one's eyes flicked about, quick and wary, but there was a resilience there that startled him. She had the look of a child too used to fear, too familiar with hunger. Caleb felt that old ache stir in him, the same one that came when Clara's face would slip unbidden into his mind, gentle features framed by sorrow, urging him to be kind. The girls collected themselves with a quiet dignity that shamed the ranch hands, who drifted off snickering. Caleb thought they might vanish into the dark then, but before they could, a new sound sliced through the night, the sharp, confident clop of hooves. A rider approached, a man who sat tall in the saddle, his coat dark as crow feathers and his boots polished to a cruel shine. Ezekiel Crowder. Caleb's jaw tightened instinctively. "Well, if it isn't the Carter girls," Crowder drawled, voice slick as oil. He reined in his horse before them, leaning forward in mock politeness. "Your daddy's debt keeps me up at night, you know. Shame he and your ma left you with more bills than sense. Not very Christian of them." The older girl stiffened, placing herself fully between him and her sister. "We'll pay you," she said evenly. "Just not tonight." Crowder's grin widened. "Oh, I don't reckon you will. Folks say you're scraping by with barely a crust of bread." He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "I got a simpler way for you to square things, Rosalie. Pretty little thing like you could work off a debt real quick." The little girl clutched at her sister's skirt, her face pale. Caleb's fingers curled slowly into fists in his pockets. He kept silent, though, watching as Crowder let his gaze flick to the younger sister, a look that sent a slow chill down Caleb's spine. "You leave us be," Rosalie hissed. Crowder chuckled, low and amused, before tugging at his reins. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll collect soon enough." He tipped his hat mockingly and rode off, leaving behind only the smell of his horse and the echo of his threat. Caleb stayed where he was, expression unreadable. The sisters gathered their few belongings, the younger one holding her sister's hand like a lifeline. They passed him without a glance, heads bowed, shadows in the lamplight. But as Rosalie brushed by, Caleb caught a flicker of defiance in her eyes, a flame not yet snuffed out by fear. Later, Caleb stood outside the mercantile with a sack of feed slung over his shoulder. The night colder now, the streets mostly empty. He was adjusting the saddle when soft footsteps hurried toward him. Rosalie appeared breathless, eyes wide but determined. She clutched the hand of her sister, who followed, silent and watchful. "Take her," Rosalie said abruptly. Caleb stilled. "What?" "Take Lily. She's small. She won't eat much. She's quiet. She won't bother you." Her voice trembled, but her gaze never faltered. Lily's hand tightened around her sister's. "Can you take her instead of me?" she whispered. The words landed heavy in the air between them, so raw and desperate they felt like a plea from another lifetime. Caleb's throat worked, but no sound came. He just stared at them, the firelight from the saloon glinting off his weathered features, his silence heavier than words. Rosalie's eyes shone with a mixture of shame and fierce love. She wasn't begging for herself. She was bartering her own loneliness so her sister might live. Caleb's chest tightened painfully. He didn't answer. He watched them retreat into the dark, Lily's small shoulders hunched under the weight of her sister's determination. When they disappeared around a corner, Caleb stood motionless, jaw clenched, haunted by what he'd just seen. That night, the fire crackled low in his cabin. He sat in his worn chair, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at the flames. Clara's shawl hung on the wall opposite him, its once bright colors faded but warm still in memory. He imagined her voice, soft and patient, urging him to listen, to see. He had built his life on silence and solitude after she passed, convinced that grief was a punishment he had to carry alone. But now he saw two girls carrying a weight far heavier than his. Sleep came late, full of dreams he couldn't quite shake. Clara smiling in the wheat fields, Lily's eyes wide with fear, Rosalie's voice breaking as she made her plea. When dawn finally split the horizon, Caleb rose with a resolve that surprised him. He packed supplies into saddlebags, slipped Clara's shawl gently inside, and saddled his mare. The sky was a pale watercolor wash of pink and gray as he rode through the awakening town. No one stirred this early, save for a few ranch hands headed out to tend cattle. Caleb guided his horse toward the edge of town, past the corral where he'd first seen the sisters, past the saloon where last night's laughter had turned bitter. He followed the dirt road out to a ramshackle cabin barely standing on its stilts. The girls were outside, crouched over a small fire, their meager breakfast sizzling faintly in a dented pan. Rosalie looked up sharply when she saw him, eyes narrowing, suspicion flaring. Lily shrank behind her. Caleb dismounted without a word, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. He stood before them, silent for a long moment, then finally spoke, his voice deep and steady. "You both come with me." Rosalie froze. "What?" "Pack what you need." He glanced around the cabin and added, "I'll wait." The sisters exchanged a bewildered look. Lily clutched her sister's hand, wide-eyed. Rosalie hesitated, every muscle taut. But there was something in Caleb's stance, his stillness, his unwavering gaze, that made her believe him. She gathered their few possessions, stuffing them into a threadbare satchel, and soon they stood before him, unsure. Caleb extended a hand to Lily, and after a long pause, she took it. Her small fingers curled around his rough palm, and something inside him shifted. A quiet, almost imperceptible click, like a door opening after years of being locked. He lifted her into the saddle, then turned to Rosalie. "Climb on." She did, reluctantly, sitting behind Lily and gripping the saddle horn. Caleb mounted behind them, the leather creaking under their combined weight. He clicked his tongue, and the mare moved forward, carrying them away from the cabin, away from the lingering shadow of Crowder's cruelty. The morning sun broke through the mist, painting the plains in soft gold. Lily leaned against Caleb's chest, her breathing slow and even, already lulled to sleep by the steady rhythm of the horse. Rosalie sat stiff, her guard still high, but her eyes softened as she glanced back at the cabin growing smaller behind them. Caleb said nothing, but in his silence was a promise, a vow he wasn't sure he'd made consciously, but knew he would keep. As they rode toward the horizon, the wind picked up, tugging gently at Clara's shawl peeking from his saddlebag. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the heaviness in his chest shift, just slightly, as though something long buried had begun to stir. The path ahead stretched wide and uncertain, but with each step of his mare's hooves, he felt himself moving not just across the land, but toward something he'd thought forever lost. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that this was only the beginning. The prairie opened wide beneath a pale morning sky as Caleb guided the mare toward his ranch, the Carter sisters clinging to him with an unspoken mixture of fear and fragile hope. The land rolled gently, dotted with sagebrush and skeletal fences, and though it was rugged and lonesome, there was safety in its vastness. Lily had fallen asleep against his chest, her small hands curled tight into his coat, while Rosalie sat tense, her eyes fixed on every shadow, every rustle of wind in the grass. Caleb didn't speak. He rarely did. Instead, his silence was steady and warm, an anchor in the uncertainty that clung to them like the morning mist. By the time they reached Boone Ranch, the sun had climbed higher, washing the old house in light that softened its weathered edges. The house stood tall but tired, its wood sun-bleached and worn by years of storms. Rosalie's expression flickered as she took in the sight. She had expected something colder, harsher perhaps, but instead, the place held a strange, quiet dignity, like a man who bore his scars without apology. Caleb dismounted first, then lifted Lily gently from the saddle. She stirred, blinking sleepily, and he handed her Clara's shawl from the saddlebag, wrapping it around her thin shoulders. She hugged it close as if it were a shield. Rosalie slid down, clutching their satchel, and followed him to the porch, her wary eyes sweeping over every detail. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke, with shelves lined by books whose spines were worn from years of careful handling. There were few signs of a woman's touch left, though here and there a memory of Clara lingered, a ceramic vase with a single dried flower, a quilt folded neatly on the arm of a chair. Caleb gestured toward the small guest room. "You can stay in here." His voice was calm, low, like distant thunder. Rosalie hesitated at the doorway, clutching Lily's hand. She muttered a quiet thank you, though her eyes remained sharp, guarded. In the days that followed, their presence shifted the rhythm of Caleb's life. He had lived in silence for so long that the small noises startled him at first. The whisper of Lily's footsteps across the wooden floors, the soft hum of Rosalie's voice as she braided her sister's hair by lamplight, the clatter of utensils as she helped herself to the kitchen. The sisters carried their pain with them, invisible but heavy, and Caleb felt it pressing against the walls of his home, testing its strength. Lily often clung to him when she passed by, her fingers slipping into his calloused hand with the trust of a child who had run out of places to hide. Rosalie remained cautious, her words clipped, her glances sharp, yet there was a spark in her, a kind of steel born from necessity, that stirred something in Caleb he couldn't quite name. Word of the sisters' presence spread quickly through the nearby town. By the end of the week, whispers followed Caleb wherever he went. Boone's taken in strays. The storekeeper murmured to a customer, not bothering to lower his voice. A woman at the mercantile clucked her tongue, saying it wasn't proper for a widower to harbor two young girls under his roof. Caleb ignored them all, as he always had, but Rosalie overheard some of it during their rare trips into town. Shame flickered across her face, though she masked it with that familiar stubborn tilt of her chin. One evening, Caleb found her standing outside by the corral, arms crossed tight against the cold wind, staring at the horizon as if trying to see a future there. He joined her silently, leaning against the fence. The sky was a wide sweep of lavender and gold, the sun bleeding out behind the hills. "You don't have to listen to them," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. Rosalie didn't look at him, but her shoulders eased slightly. "They don't know what they're talking about." Her voice was low but steady. Caleb glanced at her, catching the faint tremor in her hand as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She wasn't used to kindness, that much was clear, and the realization stirred an ache in him, sharp and unexpected. That night, after putting Lily to bed, Rosalie lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes, without being asked. Caleb worked silently nearby, repairing a broken stirrup strap, and in the quiet, something like trust began to take root. There was no sudden warmth, no easy laughter, but there were small gestures, a cup of coffee poured without a word, a blanket placed on the back of his chair, that spoke louder than any declaration. Caleb, in turn, taught her small things, like how to calm a skittish horse or mend a frayed rein. She watched his movements closely, her sharp edges softening little by little in the glow of the lantern light. But safety, he knew, was a fragile illusion. It shattered one afternoon when Ezekiel Crowder rode up to the ranch, flanked by two of his men. Caleb saw them coming long before they reached the gate, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the bright sky. He met them in the yard, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Crowder dismounted with a slow smile, the kind that carried no warmth. "You've got something of mine," Crowder said, nodding toward the house. Caleb didn't move. "You'd best leave." Crowder chuckled. "I don't think so. Those girls owe me. You think you can just take what's mine and hide them out here?" His tone was smooth, but his eyes were hard. One of his men spat in the dirt, shifting his hand toward the butt of his revolver. Caleb's stance didn't change, but his presence was like a coiled spring, silent but dangerous. "They're not yours," he said softly, "and they're not going back." Crowder tilted his head, mock amusement flickering across his face. "Men like you always think they can play hero. You'll break. They always do." Caleb didn't respond. His silence seemed to unsettle Crowder more than words could. After a tense moment, Crowder swung himself back onto his horse, eyes narrowed. "We'll settle this another day, Boone," he said, and with a jerk of his reins, he and his men rode off, their laughter echoing back like the cry of crows. That evening, a storm rolled in, heavy clouds smothering the stars. Rain drummed against the roof, while wind howled around the corners of the house. Lily woke crying from a nightmare, trembling in the dark. Caleb went to her room, crouching beside her bed. She clung to him, burying her face in his chest. "Don't let him take us," she whispered. Her small voice cracked something deep inside him. He stroked her hair gently, murmuring, "He won't. I promise." Rosalie stood in the doorway, her face pale in the flickering lamplight. She watched the way Caleb held her sister, the way his large hands trembled slightly as he comforted the child, and something shifted in her eyes. Trust wasn't given easily in her world, but tonight it bloomed quietly, fragile as a new leaf in spring. 2 nights later, Crowder returned. This time he didn't come alone. A handful of riders flanked him, torches blazing against the dark. Caleb stood in the yard, rifle in hand, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Rosalie and Lily watched from inside, the flicker of torchlight dancing across their frightened faces. The storm had not yet passed, and thunder rolled overhead like distant cannon fire. "Bring them out, Boone," Crowder called, his voice sharp as a whip. Caleb didn't answer. He stepped forward, steady and deliberate, the barrel of his rifle glinting in the light. "Turn back," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Crowder sneered and spurred his horse closer. "You think you can scare me? I'll burn this place to the ground." A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the standoff in stark white. Caleb raised his rifle, sighted carefully, and fired. The bullet shaved the edge of Crowder's hat, sending it tumbling into the mud. The sound cracked like a warning bell, and silence fell heavy as the rain. Before Crowder could recover, a lantern's glow appeared down the road. Sheriff Amos Kincaid arrived with a pair of deputies, their guns drawn. The sheriff's expression was grim as he dismounted, his voice carrying over the rain. "Enough, Crowder. You're done here." Crowder's glare darted from Caleb to the sheriff. For a moment, rage twisted his face, but then he spat into the mud and jerked his reins. "This ain't over," he snarled before turning his horse sharply. His men followed, the torches dwindling to specks of orange in the distance until darkness swallowed them. Caleb lowered his rifle slowly, breath steady. When he turned toward the house, Lily was at the door, tears streaking her face. He knelt, opening his arms, and she flew into them, clutching him as if she'd never let go. He held her close, Murmuring words meant more for himself than her. "You're safe now." The next morning, the world was washed clean. The rain had scrubbed the air crisp and bright, and sunlight poured over the ranch like a benediction. Lily played in the damp grass, her laughter soft, but freer than before. Rosalie stood on the porch, watching her sister, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Caleb emerged from the barn, sleeves rolled up, his face lined with exhaustion, yet softened by something gentler. Rosalie caught his eye. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded, tipping his hat slightly, then looked out over the land. For the first time in years, he felt something other than loneliness pressing on him, something lighter, though no less powerful. Clara's shawl hung from the porch rail, drying in the sun, a reminder of love lost, but also of love rediscovered, in a form he hadn't expected. Later, as the day faded and the sky turned to embers, Caleb sat on the porch with the sisters nearby. Lily rested her head in his lap, her breathing slow and even, while Rosalie leaned against the porch post, her expression calm but thoughtful. Caleb let his gaze drift to the horizon, where the sun was slipping behind the hills, and felt a rare sense of peace. "Maybe you've known it too," he thought, his mind speaking softly to an unseen listener. That kind of emptiness that makes a man forget how to fight. But grace comes quiet, like a hand in the dark, and sometimes it's a choice to stand, to love, to protect. That saves us all. The land lay silent around them, wide and endless. Yet for the first time in years, Caleb felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.